So I wanted to talk today a little bit about something that I haven't really talked about very much ever before. So hopefully it works. And what I wanted to do is tell you a little bit about what it was like when I started, which in 3 months will be 40 years ago. Never would have believed that. A little bit about my observations of what things are like now, some of the things that have discouraged me over the years, and some of the things that encourage me, and then a little bit about how we might be able to make this movement a little bit better, a little bit more effective for animals, and hopefully for other sectors as well, like the environment and for people as well. So I started out 40 years ago, and it's really interesting because you never think of yourself as being in something this long or as getting old. And I remember being in the office a couple of years ago with my colleague Julie Woodyer, who some of you may know, and we have interns come in every year and work for us. And they're always 18 or 20 or 22 years old. And one of them had referred to us as the elders. And Julie in particular didn't know whether to slap her or to say, gee, thank you very much, because it obviously means lots of wisdom and experience. We don't know if it just meant old or whether it meant something more positive than that, but neither of us liked it. I realized how old I was when I was attending a meeting at World Animal Protection a few years ago, and I said, oh, I remember talking to this policymaker about this issue in such and such a year, and this is what they said, and it was stalled then, and maybe we can learn from it. And two of the adult participants in the meeting put their hands up and said, we weren't born yet. I said, holy mackerel. Uh, it's been a while, but you never realize it. It just sort of catches up on you. Now, when I started, it was kind of interesting, and the exercise of looking back and thinking about when I started was interesting to me personally, but I think it's interesting when you talk about it to others as well, because back when I started, I wanted to get involved in animal issues, but there were no groups. I could not find any sort of traditional advocacy groups out there that worked on policy making and changing laws and doing investigations and things like that. They didn't exist. I attended the meeting of one group that was the only one that I could find that was advertised as an advocacy group, went to their meeting. Nothing against people who are elderly, but I think the youngest person was about 75 or 80. And the primary item on the agenda for the evening was whether to have a popcorn popper at the upcoming bazaar. That was the state of things way back then. There were few groups, even in the US, other than a sort of a handful of groups that had started in the 40s and 50s. There weren't very many. There weren't any individuals that I could find. We didn't have the internet or Facebook back then, so it was very difficult to find people. But the meetings I attended and the efforts I made to find people were largely unsuccessful. There wasn't a lot of acceptance of a lot of the issues that today are quite well accepted and talked about in a very serious way, and there was not a lot of awareness. To a large extent, the animal stuff was fringe. People thought it was sort of, hey, some people over there that are crazy cat ladies and a few others are interested in these issues, but nobody else is. They were fringe issues very much. There was very little information about what was going on in the world. I remember having to actually write letters and put stamps on them and mail away to England and to Germany and to other places that had a longer established movement for animal protection to actually find out what was going on, because there were no sources of information. And of course you had to wait 2 or 3 months or sometimes longer to get a reply to find out what was going on. And then of course you had 20 other questions, and then off goes another letter. And it was a very laborious and long-term kind of process. And of course, we didn't have any of the technologies that were available today that make effective advocacy possible. I remember my big technological innovation. This was something I thought was amazing. It was like moving into the era of Star Trek. I got a $69 electric typewriter. And that was the big technological innovation. And then after that, it was a fax machine. We thought we were in the space age because prior to the fax machine being acquired, we actually drove around Toronto from about midnight till 5 a.m. hand delivering press releases, putting them in mailbox, sliding them under doors, and doing things like that to disseminate the information. So that was the state of things back then. Not very many people, very minimal technology, not a lot of interest or acceptance. But from about 1980 to 1992, and I started doing this work in 1979, from about 1980 to 1992, there was a flurry of activity that most people don't know about. A lot of groups started at that time, or in that time period. Zoocheck started in 1984. The Toronto Humane Society at the time had a vibrant and quite large advocacy department, which some of the people in this room actually worked for. And that department was renowned throughout North America and around the world for being this very progressive and action-oriented entity. When the Toronto Humane disbanded that aspect of their organization, Animal Alliance formed. I think it was in 1992. 1990, okay, so even earlier. And then other groups started forming as well. In 1982, prior to the formation of Zoocheck, I was part of a group called Mobilization for Animals that had come up from the US and had established itself in Toronto and had actually gone from about 0 to 8,000 supporters in 8 months. There were quite a number of groups that had started up during that time period, as well as in the U.S. People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals started. The Performing Animal Welfare Society started. There were a number of groups that were sort of in an analogous situation in the U.S. in terms of the growth of the movement. So it was a really dynamic time, and of course there was more information. There were more books and articles and documentary films coming out as well. I remember back in the 80s with Mobilization for Animals, we were doing events every single week. Our monthly meetings had 200 people attending every single month, and we had about 120 of those people involved in community organizing, broken into groups that worked on logistical matters and outreach and political advocacy and all of that. We had events, some of them that attracted several thousand people. It was a really dynamic time, and there was a lot going on, and it was a very hopeful time. But after about 1992, there were groups like Animal Alliance, like Zoocheck, and a few others, and individuals that sort of slogged on. But then the conversation amongst ourselves became, why are there no new people? Why is this energy and this enthusiasm that we had witnessed previously not taken hold and created this more massive and more vibrant and more effective movement? And unfortunately, it didn't. So we slogged along, and like Liz said, we've all made some fantastic moves forward, some great successes for animals, but the broader movement just didn't materialize. Now that changed to a certain extent with the advent of the internet, because the internet basically was the game changer. And today, because of the internet and other factors, we have literally thousands of groups in North America. I think the last survey that I saw said there were about 11,000 groups in North America that would characterize themselves as animal welfare, animal rights, animal protection groups. And then you've got all kinds of other groups that promote veganism and other issues that have an animal component. So today we have quite a substantial movement. I think there was a survey done a few years ago that said about 10 million citizens in the United States say that they are members of animal rights groups. So that's a sea change from 40 years ago. There's also hundreds of sanctuaries and rescues that have started up dealing with everything from domesticated animals to dogs to wild animals. And they keep growing. They're growing exponentially in numbers. And there's countless events right across the country and across the continent and overseas. Every single week here in Toronto, there's events that have to do with animals or veganism. And if you look across the country, you look elsewhere, you'll see that if you wanted to attend them all, you couldn't. There are just too many. It would be impossible for one person to do that. Yet in the old days, you could. You could go to every animal event on the continent. It was quite easy because there weren't very many. There's more mainstream acceptance and interest and more media interest. 20 years ago, with the media, it was like with being in the political arena. These were fringe issues, but now everywhere in Canada, when we approach media, we don't find them treating these issues as fringe issues. They treat them as deadly serious. And I know Animal Alliance has done the same, and we've done it. We've cultivated media right across the country that want more information, want to get involved in these issues. And for many of them who do opinion columns and other things like that, where they're allowed to voice their own views, they have actually become advocates for animals. So no longer are these issues fringe in the media. And we don't find them to be fringe issues politically as well. Certainly not at the municipal level, maybe a little less so at the provincial or federal level. But even at those levels, we find that while we don't see the political movement we would like, there still is a lot of interest, a lot of people taking these issues very seriously. That is very, very different. And of course, as I said, the technology that allows greater reach, instantaneous reporting on issues, and an ability to network and cooperate that never existed previously is now there on every home computer. It is so different now than it was 40 years ago. It's almost beyond belief. Now, that would seemingly bode well for everything, that we should have this massive movement that is more effective with each passing year because we've got the tools and we've got the people. But that's not necessarily been the case. And that's one of the things that really, really discourages me, because I think we have the potential to do so much more. So while the interest, awareness, and numbers have skyrocketed, some other aspects of this movement just haven't come to fruition. And one of them is cooperation. And I've seen a lot of sort of groups and individuals going off in different directions in recent years. In the past, and I'm talking in the 80s and 90s and before that, all of the groups tended to focus on things and band together and cooperate and help each other. But today, I think, and it may partially be due to the numbers involved, but I think there's been a lot of people going off in different directions and not supporting each other. And I think that if we want to be effective, especially as Liz said, be an effective political force, that we have to cooperate more and we have to unify far more than we are now. I don't know, because I'm guilty of this too, I don't know what a lot of groups now are doing, and I should. And I'm sure that a lot of other groups and people out there don't know what we're doing, groups like Animal Alliance and Zoocheck. So I think there's a desperate need to cooperate more and to unify to some degree, because it's that old saying, together we're stronger, together we will be stronger. Now, with all those people and these resources, this networking, the Twitter and Instagram and all that, there's a greater number of activities. As I said, you could never go to them all if you wanted to. And unfortunately, a lot of people, they don't really understand how change works, but they have a lot of enthusiasm. They're very motivated. They want to help. They want to get active. And we get hundreds, if not thousands, of events that are occurring that occur outside the context of a larger strategic campaign. So they're isolated events that they're nice events, and maybe a few people learn something, but they don't really have a strategic purpose. And I think that we have to become aware of that, and we have to become better at using our events to achieve change, because with only a very few exceptions, this sort of proverbial making noise, attracting attention to an issue, isn't going to achieve anything. Almost every event and activity should be tied into achieving a very specific strategic goal. And I think all of us, and particularly the people that are protesting all the time, and I'm in favor of protests, absolutely, they're a wonderful change vehicle, but I think every activity that's done has to be tied into specific strategic goals, or else you're not achieving anything except maybe feeling better or getting into some type of social situation where you're with your friends who think the same. I also think that when we're looking at protests and events, we've seen lots of them, like the congregations of people who would collect down in front of Marineland in Niagara Falls and chant and try to make a ruckus and attract attention and turn away customers to the marine park, and then the protest would dissolve and people would go to a vegan restaurant or they'd go home and they'd just go about their business. I think there's on many of these events like that, these failed opportunities, because if you look at other movements and how they've survived and how they've prospered and how they've become effective, you see that when they get events and protests and these other vehicles in which you have large numbers of people assembled, they use those events as a platform for community organizing. So they don't just say, hey, let's make a few speeches, let's have a few banners, let's chant, sing, do those normal things that you do at these types of events, and then we all go home. They say, let's capitalize on that energy, that collective drive that people get, that motivation that people get when they're at these things. Let's capitalize on it and get all those people right after the event down to a hall or to a hotel room, and let's talk about how do we organize, how do we take all this energy and actually use it to make change happen. And a lot of that will be working on matters that are political in nature. And that's something that has been a failed opportunity with so many protests in Canada, not using the fact that you've got all these interested, motivated people at a place to get them somewhere and get them doing community organizing. That has to change. And we all have some level of blame in how things are developed, and I include myself in that. I think that my own group, and I'll just speak for Zoocheck alone, I think that over the years we haven't made a strong enough attempt to reach out to other groups that do protests and that, to say, how can we become a more unified force? How can we capitalize on what you're doing, and how can you capitalize or learn from what we're doing? I think we have to do a better job at that. I think we who work largely on political initiatives have to do a better job of letting the other people involved in this movement understand what we're doing. Because I have a lot of people that say, oh, I've heard of Zoocheck, or I've heard of this campaign or that campaign, but I don't really know what you do or how you do it. I think we have to do a better job in letting people out there, because not everybody wants to do what we're doing or can do it, but I think there's probably a proportion of people out there that say, I like doing this and I like doing that, but it's not enough, or maybe my skills are better used over in this other direction. So I think we who are doing more of the political advocacy side of things have to really let people know what we're doing so that they can decide if they want to get involved in that, either independently of us or with us. And one of the things that we're discussing now, and we've been discussing for the past 2 years to try to get past that impasse, is Animal Alliance and ourselves are going to do an activist school. We've been talking about it, I think, for about 3 years, and we will be getting that off the ground this year to try to bridge that gap. We know how to do some things. We don't have all the answers, but we've both had a lot of success, and we think that what we can relate to people and instruct people on will be helpful to them. So, how do we proceed? I've talked a little bit about a few ideas, but how do we proceed? Well, I'm going to give you a few points that came to me this morning. Number one, we have to take advantage of or create opportunities to cooperate and unify. I don't think many of us have really done that, or at least not in an organized, intelligent way that we should. So we have to take advantage of and create opportunities to cooperate and to unify. Number two, we have to learn from each other and from other effective modern movements as well as historical movements. A lot of the way that people operate today with protesting and all that, they're looking back at the civil rights movement or the anti-slavery movements and things like that, and there are tremendous lessons to be learned. But I think we also have to look at what was learned from the more modern movements, what was learned from the indivisible movement, fighting the Trump agenda, what was learned from the Occupy movement. We have to look at modern movements as well, not just historical movements, because if you base everything on what was learned back in the 19th century, it may not work today. So we have to learn from movements and from other sectors that are involved in movements, environmental, affordable housing, poverty relief, etc. Number three, I've mentioned it already, we have to become more strategic. And that means we have to realize that isolated events rarely, if ever, achieve the kind of change that we want. All events and all activities should be part of larger strategic initiatives. Number four, we have to make sure that every event that we do and every assembly of people has a community organizing component. Critically important. That's what you see in other successful modern movements. Number five, we have to have the courage to admit that when something isn't working, we have to have the courage to admit when something isn't working. A lot of us can't do that. We do a protest and we convince ourselves that, hey, that was effective, when in fact it wasn't. A lot of the things I do, I sit back and I say, was that useful? Should I have done it? Could I have done something better? We have to do more of this self-reflection and self-analysis so that we get better. And we don't just keep doing the same things over and over and over again and expecting them to get a result that will never happen. So we have to look at that and not convince ourselves that something that doesn't work does. Number six, as a movement, we have to reach out and find a way to connect and involve other kinds of groups that we may not have tried to cultivate previously. And I think one of them is religious groups. Now, I'm a diehard atheist, but I think it's critically important that we try to connect with religious groups, organized religious groups. They have the numbers, they have the organizational power, and in many cases they have the political clout. And I know George Monbiot, who polemicist out of England, he writes a column that hundreds of thousands of people read every week. He said that it's crazy that, he was talking about the environmental movement people, that they hadn't joined with the people in the religious side of things. Because, and he used an example in the United States where I think it was the 5 largest environmental organizations in the United States were doing a climate change rally on Capitol Hill in Washington. And they collectively, I think, got 20,000 people out to this event, which had been the biggest event at that time to try to address climate change. And George Monbiot said, well, there are single churches in the United States that get that greater numbers of people every Saturday and every Sunday, and during the week as well. And that's just one church, but there are hundreds and thousands of churches like that that bring these masses and masses of people. And many of them are socially conscious. They are interested in environmental issues. They are interested in animal issues. They are interested, obviously, in poverty relief and disease and all those other things. There are people, large numbers of people in those religious communities that do think like we do, and we have never tapped into them, and we should. And then, of course, as Liz said, and as I said, we have to learn from people in the political arena. If we want to learn how change happens, we have to go to those people or study what they do or become involved in what they do so that we learn experientially. We have to learn from the political arena. And if we don't, we'll only ever get little tiny changes. Sure, they're important for animals, but the big changes that we want just won't happen. Now, I just want to finish off with one sort of random idea that came to me this morning, actually at about 11:25 before I hopped in the car to come over here. And I'm always thinking about how do we get people more involved? How do we get people motivated? How do we get people thinking, in a way where they're not complacent, where they just say, okay, I'm going to get up and do something. And one of the things that we found at Zoocheck, and I'm sure it's the same at Animal Alliance, and it's the same at many other groups, is that, we have some of the know-how, but we don't have the numbers. We don't have the thousands and thousands of people that instantly respond to everything we do. And I was trying to think, well, how could we get some of these people involved in some of these things? And the idea I came up with this morning was what I call peer pressure action groups. I thought, why don't we, as a community, get people to sign up to basically an activist list where everything is public. So everybody on that list, anybody can go to the internet and see who's on that list, and then have a checklist of columns. So it could be an important committee meeting coming up at the City of Toronto. It could be some initiative to help agricultural animals in transport. It could be something, all of them geared toward things that have a particular specific goal in mind. And we ask people on that list, and they can opt in or opt off of the list if they want to. Hopefully they would stay in, to let people know by checking what they've done. Have they written a letter? Have they contacted their politician? Have they attended a committee meeting? And use peer pressure to try to get more people to get involved, because I think there's a lot of people that just need that little nudge to get involved. And I thought that might be a really interesting way to do it. We certainly see peer pressure applied both in industry, in other kinds of activities, but I don't really see it applied too much in this sector. So that was one sort of random idea that I thought I'd share with you. Now, every single time I talk, I like to do the rah, 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 let's get motivated, all this kind of stuff. And I have this list of principles that I wrote about activism. There's 7 principles. I'm only going to tell you about the last one and read a quote. The last one deals with all the work that we do. And actually, I had a conversation with Liz about this just yesterday. I think I'm taping here. I had a conversation with Liz about this very subject, and it's the fact that when you enjoy doing this work, you do it far more vigorously and aggressively, and you never burn out. And the conversation that Liz and I had was all the political work, the machinations of getting change to happen. We both love that stuff. A lot of people don't. But if you can learn to love this work, learn to love the struggles, then you never burn out, and I think you just can get better and better and better as you go. And I, in my 7 principles of activism, it's rule number 7, and it's 3 words: enjoy the fight. You have to learn to enjoy this work, enjoy making change happen. And if you do, you will be a fantastic long-term activist. And there's a quote I want to read by the great desert writer, Edward Abbey. He wrote Desert Solitaire, The Monkey Wrench Gang, and a bunch of fantastic books that you could read. And it relates to enjoying the fight. And some of you may have heard me say this before, but I love it. I read it every day. It's on my computer. So I wanted to finish off by just reading it for you. And I hope you take it to heart. And I hope you, if you don't already, learn to enjoy the fight. So here's what Edward Abbey said. Do not burn yourselves out. Be as I am, a reluctant enthusiast, a part-time crusader, a half-hearted fanatic. Save the other half of yourselves and your lives for pleasure and adventure. It is not enough to fight for the land. It is even more important to enjoy it while you can, while it's still here. So get out there and hunt, not that we would, and fish and mess around with your friends. Ramble out yonder and explore the forests, climb the mountains, bag the peaks, run the rivers, breathe deep of that yet sweet and lucid air. Sit quietly for a while and contemplate that precious stillness, that lovely, mysterious, and awesome space. Enjoy yourselves, keep your brain in your head and your head firmly attached to your body, the body active and alive. And I promise you this much. I promise you this one sweet victory over our enemies, over those desk-bound men and women with their hearts in a safe deposit box and their eyes hypnotized by desk calculators. I promise you this, you will outlive the bastards. So never give up. Thanks.